And I think we're live. So hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. For those new here, my name's Nicki. I'm an author and editor and I post videos here on YouTube about writing, editing, reading and all the other things I love. Today we're here for my end of the month reading wrap up. I got through about 25 books in June, so there's plenty to discuss, quite a range of different styles of prose and different genres, so I hope there'll be something here for everyone. I'm going to kick straight off since we do have a fair few to get through. The first book I read was They Called Me Wyatt by Natasha Tynes, and this is a book I received as an ARC. And the basic premise of the story is that there's a young woman who is murdered and her spirit ends up inside this baby boy whose parents call him Wyatt. And she, at different times during his life, she's conscious of who she is and what's going on. At other times she's not. And she decides that she wants to find out who murdered her and what really happened to her. So the premise really interested me, which is what made me agree to review when I got the request through. And it was a bit of a mixed bag for me. I gave it 3.5 stars. I really loved the idea, but the main thing I struggled with was the fact that I didn't actually like any of the characters. They were all incredibly selfish, particularly the main heroine. She didn't really care about this guy's life she was taking over. All she cared about was dealing with her own problems. She didn't stop to think about how what she was doing was affecting him and his relationships and friendships and things. And I just found it really hard to get behind her because of that. And that kind of put me off a little bit. I didn't really feel a connection with her. I didn't really care about her getting her vengeance, or at least some sort of ending to what she was going through, because I just kept getting really annoyed with her. But 3.5 stars, just because I thought it was a really intriguing idea. And so it's worth having a look at just for that point of view, if that sounds like your sort of thing. Next up, I read a book of Russian fairy tales. This was a book I bought, and it's the Fairytales collected by Aleksandr Afanasyev, and it's a pretty thick, 600-700 page book of all these collected fairy tales. It was a 5-star read for me. It's really fascinating to see actually how some of the Russian stories are so close to ones we're familiar with from Germany, France, Brothers Grimm, Perrault, and yet others that have a very distinctly Russian flavour. As you read through, you obviously do get a fair bit of repetition, similar story motifs reappearing again and again, but it was certainly really interesting, and I also enjoyed some of the commentary at the end that was looking at some of the comparisons with other European traditions. Next up, I've got 3 books, all of which I received secondhand from my good friend Sara when I went up to visit her in Quorn a few weeks back. The first of these is Free Food for Millionaires by Min-Jin Lee. And this one also crosses off South Korea for my Around the World reading challenge. And this book I gave 3 stars to. It's a very hefty tome. It's a contemporary drama, literary fiction. And what I did enjoy about it was the way it reflected on the way of life for immigrants, particularly the difference between the first generation and second generation, where you have the older generation who still, although they've moved to a new country, they've still got a lot of their traditional ways and beliefs, whereas the second generation who have been born, or at least have grown up for the bulk of their lives in their new country, have adapted much more to its ways. And that creates a bit of a gap of expectation between the two, which can cause some parent and children rifts. And I liked that. I thought that looked at that in a really interesting way, but I thought the book was absolutely too wordy. I mean, it was quite a hefty tome, 600 odd pages again, and I really felt every one of those 600 pages. It felt like a slog. There was a lot of description that just didn't seem necessary to me. It could have been really pared down, and you'd still have got everything you wanted to get from the story. And the other thing that kind of spoilt it for me in a way was that I could not stand Casey, the main girl. A bit like in the book I mentioned just now. Just if you don't like the main character, the protagonist, it does cause problems. And she was just so annoying. She was just such entitled brat at times, and she constantly had money problems. And yet when she had no money, she'd just max out her credit cards buying unnecessary dresses and bags and designer clothing. And And you just thought, for goodness sake, pull yourself together. Like, you wouldn't have all these issues if you just were a little bit more conservative and lived within your means, And she just completely irritated me from that point of view. So look, it's worth reading if you're interested in what it would be like to move from one country to another and how that might affect your relationship with your family. But overall, this isn't a book that I'd rush to ever read again, and it's not one that I'd particularly go around recommending to friends, just because I just didn't feel it. It didn't really grip me in the way I would have liked. Next up, Enter Night by Michael Rowe. This is a vampire story, and it was a 3.5-star read for me. This is vampires in the more traditional monster sense, as opposed to the Byronic hero, Anne Rice Lestat kind of sense. And I tend to prefer the brooding hero vampire, but I don't mind reading the horror style ones as well. And this was done quite well. There was definitely echoes of Stephen King's Salem's Lot going on. And overall, I enjoyed the sort of mythology and the build-up, but I kind of felt we were missing a POV from the vampire. We've got one principal vampire character. Several other people become vampires during the course of the story, but we have this main principal vampire who's been calling out to this slightly deranged guy to come and free him. A bit of a Renfield sort of character, if you like. And when he's finally free, nothing really comes of it. We don't get any POV for him. We don't really get to understand his motivations, what's driving him to do what he's doing in the town. We've just got all these POV characters, some of whom are then killed off. I don't want to spoiler it too much. The best character actually was this young boy, and I really enjoyed his POV. It came across so well. He was a brilliant character, and he was actually the highlight of the story for me, I think. That just worked wonderfully. But I kind of wanted to just understand the vampire's motivations a lot more, and it never really came to light. Next up, The Memory of Midnight by Pamela Hartshorne. And this is yet another 3.5 stars for me. You'll see it is a really mixed bag this month. I've read some that I absolutely loved and giving 5 stars to, but there's also been a few middle of the road kind of reads. And The Memory of Midnight is another of those. This is one of those dual narrative type historical fictions where you have part of the story taking place in the past and part of it taking place in the present with someone who's investigating what's gone on in the past. Except this one had the added twist that there was a kind of fantasy, magical realism-like link between the two characters. And the character in the present had this kind of mystical link to the main female character in the past, and was kind of seeing things that had happened to her and like almost going off into these little trances and things and glimpsing her life. And there was a little bit of a murder mystery kind of element involved as well. There was a strong focus on women and the role of women and the husband's power over women. Both of them had abusive husbands. And it was really entertaining. I did enjoy the fantasy element, but it wasn't a book that I'd absolutely rush to read again and again. If this is the kind of thing you enjoy, these dual story historicals, and you like a little bit of a fantasy edge to them, then you definitely find something to enjoy in this. For me, it was 3.5 stars. I didn't dislike it, but it just isn't something that's going to stick with me for many years to come. Next up, we're moving back to a NetGalley read. And this one is Lucifer Volume 1, The Infernal Comedy by Dan Watters. This one, I actually have never read any of the Sandman universe graphic novels. I do love the Lucifer TV series though, which is why I decided to request this book, just to see what some of the graphic novels using that character were like. Overall, I enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. It was an entertaining story. Lucifer's kind of been trapped. I'm trying not to spoiler it too much, but he's gone missing. He's been trapped and he's trying to find his way out. And there are all these really interesting links to Shakespeare, to The Tempest, with Caliban and Sycorax. And I thought that worked brilliantly. I liked the artwork. I thought there was a good blend of mixing artwork with text. It was nicely paced. There were some bits at the beginning where I felt a little bit lost because they were referencing the Sandman universe. So those who are familiar with all that would probably get a bit more out of it. But once the main story got going, then it wasn't a problem. I could keep up with what was happening, and it didn't matter that I hadn't read any of the previous works. So moving on, and going back to fairy tales, I read Norwegian folk tales of Asbjörnsen and Moe in a new translation that's just releasing. This was a NetGalley read again, and it's another 5-star read for me. It was an absolutely delightful collection of fairy tales. I thought the translation worked brilliantly. It was really flowing, easygoing prose. It didn't feel clunky and obviously translated. And again, as with the Russian ones, it's just really fascinating to see the links between similar themes that you get from different parts of Europe, compared to the little bits that are just sort of quirky and particular to a certain region. And this one, definitely, if you're a fan of fairy tales and folk tales, it's definitely worth taking a look at. Next up was quite an interesting one for me because I received an email from a publisher based in Germany, and they were asking me to review a new book that they had out. And this was a book that was essentially Liebeskrimi is what they're called in German, which very literally translates to love crime. So they are kind of crime stories, but with a romance, often sort of erotic romance element. It didn't particularly appeal to me, but I wrote back to the publisher in German just for practice, and we started a bit of a conversation, and she asked if I'd be willing to review one of the other books. And I had a look, and they're all pretty similar things, so it's not really my genre, but one of them did stand out to me as a bit more interesting sounding to me personally. So I decided to give it a go. It was called Blutpsalm, Blood Psalm, by Meredith Winter, and I gave this 3 stars. Now, this is a book essentially that there's a series of murders taking place in a small town, and at the same time there's this romance going on between a prostitute and a young priest. And I don't want to spoil anything, so I'm not going to get too deep into what happens and what goes on. It was pretty predictable. I mean, it's the kind of genre book where you do know what's going to happen fairly well ahead of time. I didn't immediately guess the killer, so that was a plus. But in terms of the way the romance was going to go and things, I did pretty much have it all mapped out in my head before we got there. But it still was really great fun. It was amusing. It was brilliant practice for my German. I picked up some new terms, and not sexual ones, by the way, I should say. My favourite one was actually the German equivalent of grinning like a Cheshire cat, which I'd never come across before. So that was amusing to learn that. So I'm glad I read it. It was good practice. It's not a genre that I'm going to be rushing back to again and again, but there is an English translation of this particular book in the works. So you may see me mention it on my blog or something later, because I have agreed with the publisher that I'll do a little bit of promo for them once it comes out. So next up, and we're back to NetGalley, and this one is The Devil's Slave by Tracy Borman, and this is the second book in the Francis Gorge trilogy, of which I read the first one previously on NetGalley. So this is set during the reign of James I. Frances is a young woman who's skilled in herbs and medicine, and as such she's often being earmarked by different characters as a witch. In the previous book, which took place around the Gunpowder Plot, her lover was killed, and she's pregnant with his child and ends up going into an arranged marriage with a friend of his to help cover that up in this book. Meanwhile, she is forced back to court and is once again caught up in various intrigues of Catholic plotters. This was a 4-star read for me. I thought it was a nice continuation of the story, but it was a bit less exciting than the first book, because I think having the Gunpowder Plot as the central theme in the first book really helped. That's a kind of key event that everyone's familiar with, whereas this time the plots were a little bit more obscure. There wasn't that big central moment, if you like. But it was still enjoyable, and I definitely continue and read the final book in the trilogy to see how things work out for her. Next up, and we're back to a bit of a folktale kind of feel again, with The Girl Who Became a Goddess by Theresa Fuller, another NetGalley read. And this was also a 4-star read for me. Now, this is a collection of tales more from Malaysia, Singapore, a little bit China. So I really enjoyed the fact that a lot of them were new to me. I've not read a lot from that area of the world. The only thing I did think, though, was it could have done with another really strong round of edits. There were problems with the prose, things that just didn't flow right. And it just read a bit clunky. And there was a bit of repetition and some other annoying things like that. And I think another strong round of edits just would have really helped lift it. But it was definitely interesting, and I'd like to read more from that part of the world, from that continent in the future. And next up is another read that I was able to use to cross something off my Around the World reading challenge. And this one is The Mask Collectors by Ruvanne Pietersz Vilhauer. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Apologies if I'm not. And it is, she's from Sri Lanka, and there is a Sri Lankan mythology, folklore element to the story, which is essentially a bit of a murder mystery thriller. It's a really sort of mixed genre piece, a bit of fantasy, thriller, mystery. For me, this was a 3.5-star read. It was enjoyable. I liked all the Sri Lankan folklore references, but I would have liked to have got a little bit more from them as well. And I thought from that point of view, it was a bit misleading because it really played that element up in the blurb, and it really wasn't that big a part of the plot when it came down to it. It was more about pharmaceutical companies doing devious things than it was about Sri Lankan folklore. So I think, maybe that was a bit misleading, and that might put a few readers off if they've come into it expecting something that it's not. So yeah, it was still interesting though. So if you like these kind of thriller mysteries with a bit of a folklore element thrown in, then it's worth checking out. It may not be to everyone's taste, but just be aware that the folklore is not the big major driving force behind the story. Next, I have another NetGalley read, which is The Storm and Fury by Jennifer L. Armentrout. Now, this is the first book in a new, I can't remember if it's going to be a duology or a trilogy, but a new sort of short series anyway. And it's based around gargoyles, which I've seen these gargoyles becoming a bit of a thing in recent times, but I hadn't personally read any stories with them as characters yet. So I did really enjoy that. This was a 4-star read for me. I thought there were some good plot twists. I generally liked the characters. It was a fun premise. I actually discovered after I had read this that it's a spin-off from a previous series she's done. And it's interesting that my favourite character in this book was actually one of the side characters. But when I went back and looked at this other series she's done, this guy is actually the main character or one of the main characters in the original series. So I'm thinking that I might in the future go back and read that original series because I absolutely love this guy. And I think that I'd prefer to read him as a principal figure than just a little side extra, if you like. So I would read more. I would carry on with the series, but I definitely, do want to go back and check out these other books because this guy was a demon and he was just great fun, and I'd love to spend more time with him in a book as well. And next up, I'm going to talk about 2 books together here, because they are the second and third books in, I'm just crossing them off my list, where are you? There it is. In a trilogy, and that's the Shades of Magic trilogy, which, if you remember, I read A Darker Shade of Magic in May and talked about that one in my last vlog. So this month I managed to finish A Gathering of Shadows and A Conjuring of Light. So this is the trilogy by V.E. Schwab, and the first book I enjoyed, but interestingly enough, I actually loved the second book even more, which is unusual. Usually the second books in trilogies are the weaker ones, but there's been a few cases recently where I've come to a second book and I found it really an improvement on the first book. And I think some of that is because in the first book, a lot of time is spent doing the world building in fantasy. And the second book, you know the characters, you know what's going on, and you can get straight into the action, which does help. So these were both 5-star reads for me. I loved the continuation of Kel and Delilah's story. I really enjoyed Kel's relationship with Rye and how that progressed now that they're linked together in books 2 and 3. And I thought the whole concept just came together so brilliantly. Everything that had been set up in the first book was just really strengthened as we went through books 2 and 3. And they're definitely ones I'd like to eventually get copies of for my shelf, because I would like to dip back into them in the future. And I am still planning to get onto the graphic novel Still Prince series eventually as well, to catch up on that prequel story. So moving along, I read Coral by Sarah Eller, and this was a NetGalley read again. Now this one is a really interesting piece. It claims it's based on The Little Mermaid, and it kind of is, but incredibly loosely. So one thing you shouldn't do is approach this book thinking that it is a standard fairy tale retelling, because you'd probably be disappointed. I gave it 3.5 stars. I really loved the author's aim, which was to look at mental health issues and how they can affect both the person suffering from them and those around them. And I think from that point of view, it did a good job. However, the story was really unnecessarily complex. There were a lot of different character POVs, and they kept jumping back and forth in time. And it was possible to follow what was going on. It wasn't that obscure, but it made it hard work, and it kind of detracted from the story because you were so obsessed with trying to keep up with what was going on. Some of the connections between them were a little bit obscure. They did become clear by the end. But again, that's a long time to wait to work out what's going on in a book that's already fairly heavy with big sort of issue moments, if you like. So 3.5 stars, because I do applaud her for what she's trying to achieve with it. But I just think if she could have done so in a slightly simpler manner, and perhaps not play up the Little Mermaid connection so much, since it really isn't that big a part of the story. You kind of get there, you get it at first in the first few chapters, and then it does rather disappear. And I think that might alienate some readers who have come to it expecting a standard retelling. So 3.5 stars. I would definitely try something else from this author in the future, and just see where their writing's going at that point. And sticking with NetGalley, I read Spellbound by Allie Therin. Or Therin, I'm not sure how we're saying that, whichever way. This was a 4.5 star read for me. Now, this is gay romance fantasy story. There's a bit of magic going on in this tale. We have our main guy, Arthur, who he's non-magical, but he has lots of magical friends. And he's doing his part to try to keep dangerous magical artifacts out of the wrong hands. And along the way, he meets Rory, who is going to be really useful to him because he's someone who can touch an object and see its history. And the romance between them I thought worked really well, because it wasn't love at first sight. It built up slowly. You really got to see that relationship develop. And I found the premise and the plot exciting and interesting. It held my interest throughout. It was great fun, really original. And this is the first book in a planned series, I believe, so I'd definitely be interested in carrying on and reading more about these two in the future. Next up, a complete change of pace for The Work of Art by Mimi Matthews. This was a 5-star read for me. It's a Regency romance. And what I loved about this one were very original characters. You have a young woman who has mismatched colour eyes, which makes her a bit of an object of speculation. And she is being sought in marriage by the Duke, who is a bit of a collector of rare objects, but who has a slightly sinister reputation. Meanwhile, she has met Captain Haywood, who is an injured soldier back from the Peninsular War. And the two of them hit it off straight away. And eventually, in order to escape the Duke's clutches, they contemplate a marriage of convenience to take her off the marriage market. So there is a bit of a mystery going on, a little bit of a minor thriller aspect as well behind the romance. And I thought that worked really well. I loved the romance between the two main characters. As I said, it was really beautifully developed, didn't feel too rushed or forced. And the plot certainly held my interest, and I wanted to know what was going to happen to them and if things were going to work out by the end. So a really fun read if you're a fan of historical romance, Regency romance. So moving along, and we're back to Victoria Schwab. So this time with 2 of her YA series that I read. The first little duo is the Archived and the Unbound. These were both 4.5-star reads for me. And the basic premise of this series is that there's a place called the Archive, and once you die, the sort of memory of who you were, a sort of almost ghost-like version of yourself, is stored in the archive for posterity. Sometimes these memory selves escape into the Narrows, which is a place in between the real world and the archive. And our young heroine has to patrol the archive. She's one of the people who walks around in the Narrows whenever someone escapes and gets them back into the archive. This is a story, I don't want to say anything too much more about this because I don't want to spoiler it, but it was a really fun premise, very original. I liked the characters. I thought the book 2 was a good continuation, and it kind of left it open for, although it wasn't a satisfying conclusion in some ways, it did leave it open. So I don't know whether the author will be returning to it at some point, but there was definitely room to do so. So this is a book that's fantasy. There's a little bit of a issue of the soul soldier versus the corporation element going on. There's a bit of a love triangle as usual in the YA. I did love both the guys, actually. I thought they're both really well written and well developed characters. And overall, if you like YA fantasy, definitely take a look. Next up was V. Schwab's other duology, YA, which I loved even more than the Archived. This is the Monsters of Verity series. And in these books, the premise is their acts of violence create monsters. And in Verity, the town, there are 3 types of monsters. There's the sort of lower level demon types that are more shadow creatures that just come out and eat bones and flesh and things. They have sharp claws and teeth. Then there's the Malkai, who are sort of vampire-like creatures in many ways. They're not completely bound by sunlight, but they find it easier to move around at night, and they drink blood. And then there's the Sunai, and the Sunai are the rarest, and they have the power to use music to reap souls. And the only way to tell them apart from human, unlike the other 2 who look monstrous, is that if you see them through a photograph, a video camera, their eyes are like black smudges. And August Flynn is a Sunai, and he's been tasked to go into the high school to keep watch on Kate, who is the daughter of the guy who's controlling the other half of the city, because the city has been split into 2 between the 2 families. Kate's father has allied himself with some of the monsters, taking them under his control, and he charges people protection money for not letting the monsters attack them, whereas on the other side of the city, their aim is to eradicate the monsters. So it's a bit of a Romeo and Juliet kind of set up in a way between Kate and August. I really loved them. I think August in particular is a stunning character. We really see him develop, particularly in book 2, as he starts to embrace the darker side of what he can do. And again, I just don't want to spoil things too much, but it's a really imaginative YA fantasy, very different than anything else I've seen out there. And I would definitely recommend it. It's really excellent storytelling. Next up, and we're sticking with YA fantasy, and this is a book I received as a free copy that I won in a giveaway from the publisher, and it's The Crown of Coral and Pearl by Mara Rutherford. This was 3.5 stars for me. I really wished I could have loved this more than I did. It had a really interesting sounding premise from the blurb, but when I started reading, I found it kind of obvious. The romance felt like insta-love. They didn't spend that much time together, and yet they were desperately mad for each other. And the ending felt really rushed. After a slow build-up, within a couple of chapters, it was suddenly all concluded. And it was done so in a way that really was a deus ex machina. There were these things that were mentioned earlier in the plot, just throwaway comments about things, and then suddenly those things become the climax, that the way that we're going to save everything, and yet they were never properly developed or really looked at in any detail, which I felt was a shame, because I think if this book had been done as a duology, and they'd spent a bit more time setting up the romance, setting up some of these subplot points, then it could have been really good. But I think doing it in one book was too rushed, and it just made it too predictable, and it made the relationship seem really false. But 3.5 stars, mainly for the originality of the idea, which I did enjoy. Moving along, I read Milton in Purgatory by Edward Vass, and this was a NetGalley read, and it's a novella, literary fiction, contemporary work, and it's kind of a weird, almost Dantean purgatory kind of feel about it. Milton is an average guy who is mown down in the street one day, and then he wakes up and sees bloody footprints all over his floor. When he follows these, he soon discovers that he's actually dead. He's in purgatory, and the story follows him as he tries to walk the path and make his way to his final destination, causing havoc and a few problems on the way. There's some violent events and things going on around him. There's a huge amount of really wry black humour in this piece. And it's a British author, and it did have a really British feel about it, actually. And I think that's partly the style of the humour. Felt very much like home to me. You could definitely tell that it was an English piece. So definitely great fun. It was 4 stars for me. Enjoyable if you just want a really short, quick, easy little read that you can finish in one sitting. And it's a literary fiction with a bit of a fantasy, magical realism twist to it. And that brings me to the final 3 books of the month, which I've saved to do together since they are a trilogy yet again. And this is the Shadow and Bone trilogy, so the first trilogy of Grishaverse by Leigh Bardugo. This is a series that I've had on my radar for quite a while now, and it's just been one of those, like the V.E. Schwab novels, really, that I didn't read at the time they were first coming out. And then over the years, I've kind of and ahed. I've heard good things about them, wanted to read them, but I haven't really had the money to spend not knowing if I'm going to like them. So I've started visiting my library a bit more in the last month or two, and I've been able to get some of these books from there. And I absolutely fell in love with this world right from book 1. Alina is a really engaging heroine. I loved the premise and the subtle links to Russian folklore. I thought they were nicely woven in to what was otherwise an original fantasy tale. But for me, the main thing, and this will surprise no one if you know me, but the main thing I loved was the character of the Darkling, who is an absolutely fascinating character and so well drawn. In some ways, I almost wanted him to have his own POV, but I can see why Bardugo didn't do that, because I think it would take away some of the mystery and around Alina's feelings for him and thoughts about him, which are often fairly confused and contradictory, because she dislikes him and what he stands for, but she's also drawn to him. I thought this book worked really well. I really loved the introduction of Nikolai Lantsov's character from book 2 onwards as well. He's a little bit like Rye in some ways in Shades of Magic, in that he's the kind of slightly arrogant playboy prince. There was some really witty, amusing dialogue whenever he's in a scene, which is enjoyable. And I'm quite looking forward, as I continue working through Grishaverse, to eventually get to the new duology that Bardugo is writing surrounding him. The first book's already out, so once I've caught up with the 2 Six of Crows books, I will be requesting that one from the library too. So for me, the first 2 books, Shadow and Bone and Siege and Storm, were 4.5 star reads for me. With the second book, I did once or twice feel the pacing was a little bit slow, particularly when the scenes of Alina just trying to maneuver her way around the court and her new followers. I just kind of wanted that to speed up and get to some of the good Darkling moments once or twice, but that pacing issue was definitely fixed in book 3, which moved at a really good rate with plenty of action. And book 3, I've given 5 stars too, because I think it was a perfect culmination of everything that had come before. So I am looking forward to continuing. I hope to read the Six Crows duology and Language of Thorns during next month. I've got them on request from the library. And after that, I will request The King of Scars to get me completely up to date with Grishaverse. I'm also requesting from the library the Still Prince first volume via Schwab to continue that series and catch up there, and also the Near Witch, which is the only other Victoria Schwab YA title I haven't read yet. So they're all on request at the library. So with luck, if they come in, I will have those to share with you either next month or August as I read those. I'm really looking forward now to getting into Vengeful, which my copy arrived the other day, so I can finish the Villains Geology by V.E. Schwab as well. So that one I'm going to be starting very, very soon, hopefully today, and I will have that for you next time. So that brings me to the end of my June reads. I hope you found something in there that caught your interest, that you might like to go off and have a try. And I am going to be back tomorrow with a pre-filmed video, which is a book tag, and it is the mid-year freakout book tag. I filmed it a couple of days ago. It's all uploaded ready, so that will go live tomorrow morning, less than 24 hours. So do look out for that. I'll be talking about some of my favourite things that I've read so far this year, some of the things I'm still looking forward to reading. And it's just a fun little tag, and if you want to check it out and join in, please do so. Otherwise, after that, I'll be back in July with my normal scheduling of vlogs, and I will look forward to seeing you all again then. Bye for now, everyone.